Let's take a look at aligning total rewards with strategy. The compensation plan should first advance the firm's strategic aims. This means creating a compensation package that produces the employee behaviors the firm needs to achieve its competitive strategy. Put another way, there should be a clear line of sight between each reward and specific business goals. We will see that many employers formulate a total reward strategy to support their strategic aims. These total rewards encompasses traditional pay, but also rewards such as career development. The equity theory of motivation postulates that people are motivated to maintain a balance. It also states that if a person perceives an inequity, a tension or drive will develop that motivates them to reduce the tension and perceived inequity. In compensation, one can address external, internal, individual, and procedural equity. External equity refers to how a job's pay rate in one company compares to a pay rate in another. Internal equity refers to how fair the job's pay rate is when compared to other jobs within the same company. For instance, is the sales manager pay fair when compared to what production managers earn? Individual equity refers to fairness of an individual's pay as compared with their coworkers earning the same or very similar jobs with the company based on each person's performance. Procedural equity refers to the perceived fairness of the process and procedures used to make decisions regarding the allocation of pay. Managers address equity issues in various ways. They use salary surveys, surveys of what other employers are paying, to monitor and maintain external equity. They use job analysis and job evaluation to maintain internal equity. They use performance appraisal and incentive pay to maintain individual equity. Some organizations administer attitude surveys to monitor employees' pay satisfactions. Questions typically include how satisfied are you with your pay and what factors do you believe we use to determine your pay. Open pay policies, listening to what everyone earns, may help reduce inequities, such as the gender pay gap, but can obviously cause other disagreements. Some firms therefore maintain pay rate secrecy. Most employers don't have these types of open pay policies. Employers do not have free rein in designing pay plans. For example, the 1931 Davis-Bacon Act lets the Secretary of Labor set wage rates for laborers and mechanics employed by contractors working for the federal government. Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act makes it unlawful for employers to discriminate against any individual with respect to hiring, compensation, terms or conditions of employment because of race, color, religion, sex, and national origin. The Fair Labor Standards Act, originally passed in 1938 and since amended, contains minimum wage, maximum hour, overtime pay, equal pay, record keeping, and child labor provisions that are familiar to most working people. One familiar provision governs overtime pay. It says that employers must pay overtime at a rate of at least 1.5 times the normal rate of pay for any hours worked over 40 in a work week. Specific categories of employees are exempt from the FLSA or certain provisions of the Act, and particularly from the Act's overtime provisions. A person's exemption depends on his or her responsibilities, duties, and salary. To minimize the risk of independent contractor misclassifications, employers should execute written agreements with all independent contractors. Employers should not impose work rules on or attempt to prohibit independent contractors from working for others. They should also require contractors to provide their own tools and be separately incorporated business entities. The Equal Pay Act, an amendment to the Fair Labor Standards Act, states that employees of one sex may not be paid wages at a rate lower than that to paid of employees of the opposite sex for doing roughly the equivalent type of work. Various other laws influence compensation decisions. For example, the Americans with Disabilities Act prohibits discrimination against qualified persons with disabilities in all aspects of employment. Each state also has its own workers' compensation and other applicable employment law. Unions and labor regulation law also influence pay plan design. The National Labor Relations Act of 1935, known as the Wagner Act, granted employees the right to unionize and bargain collectively. Historically, the wage rate has been the main issue in collective bargaining. However, unions also negotiate other pay-related issues, including time off with pay, cost of living adjustments, and healthcare benefits. The Wagner Act created the National Labor Relations Board known as the NLRB to oversee employer practices and to ensure that employees receive their rights. To do this, employers must furnish the union with information that is relevant and necessary to the union performing its duties, including a written explanation of the employer's wage curves, the graph that relates to job and pay rate. The union is also entitled to know members' salaries. The employer's compensation strategy will manifest itself in pay policy. For example, it might be the policy of a top hospital like Johns Hopkins to pay nurses 20% above the market wage. Employers need policies on a variety of compensation-related matters. These would include, for instance, how to set base salary, how to award salary increases, how to handle leaves for military service, jury duty, and holidays, and whether to emphasize seniority or performance through annual raises. How to account for geographic differences in cost of living is another big pay policy issue. For example, the average base pay for an office supervisor ranges from about $49,980 in Florida to $60,980 in New York. Employers handle cost of living differentials for transferees in several ways. One is to pay a differential for ongoing costs in addition to a one-time allocation. Others simply raise the employee's base salary. You can use two basic approaches to compare the worth of several jobs. First, you might decide that one job is more important than another is and not dig any deeper. As an alternative, you could compare the jobs by focusing on certain basic factors the jobs have in common. Compensation management specialists call these compensable factors. They are the factors that establish how the jobs compare to one another and determine the pay for each job. Some employers develop their own compensable factors. However, most use factors popularized by packaged job evaluation systems or by federal legislation. For example, the Equal Pay Act uses four compensable factors: skills, effort, responsibility, and working conditions. Choosing compensable factors plays a big role in job evaluation. You usually compare each job with all comparable jobs using the same compensable factors. The compensable factors you use depend on the job and the job evaluation method. Job evaluation is a judgmental process and demands close cooperation. The initial steps include identifying the need for the program, getting cooperation, and then choosing an evaluation committee. The committee then performs the actual evaluation. Identifying the need for the job evaluation shouldn't be difficult. For example, dissatisfaction reflected in high turnover, or managers may express uneasiness with an informal way of assigning pay rates. Employees may fear that a systematic evaluation of their jobs may reduce their pay rates, so getting employees to cooperate in evaluation is important. Finally, choose a job evaluation committee. The committee usually consists of about 5 members, most of whom are employees. A human resource specialist is usually included to provide expert assistance. The evaluation committee then performs 3 main functions. First, it usually identifies 10 or 15 key benchmark jobs against which the relative importance or value of all other jobs is compared. Next, the committee may select compensable factors, although the HR department will usually choose these. Finally, the committee performs its most important function, actually evaluating the worth of each job. The committee will probably use ranking, job classification, or a point method of job evaluation. The simplest job evaluation method ranks each job relative to all others. Job analysis is the first step. Here, job descriptions for each job are prepared, and the information they contain about the job's duties is usually the basis for ranking jobs. Then we select and group jobs. It is usually not practical to make a single ranking for all jobs in an organization. The usual procedure is to rank jobs by department or in clusters, such as factory workers or clerical workers. Then we select compensable factors. In the ranking method, it's common to use just one factor, like job difficulty, and to rank jobs based on the whole job. Then we rank jobs. For example, each rater gets a set of index cards, each of which contains a brief description of a job. They then arrange these cards from lowest to highest. Then we combine the rankings. Usually, several raters rank the jobs independently. Then the rating committee or the employer can simply average the raters' rankings. Then we compare the current pay policy with what others are paying based on the salary survey. Next, we show on the same table what others in the community are paying for similar jobs based on salary surveys that we conduct. Then we assign a new pay scale. Finally, we compare what we are currently paying for each job to what others are paying and decide, in this case, to adjust or pay the pay scale by raising what we pay for each job. This is the simplest job evaluation method as well as the easiest to explain, and it usually takes less time than other methods. Drawbacks derive more from how managers use ranking than from the method itself. For example, there's a tendency to rely too heavily on guesstimates, since ranking usually does not use compensable factors. Similarly, ranking provides no yardstick for quantifying the value of one job relative to another. Ranking is usually more appropriate for small employers who can't afford the time or expense of a more elaborate method. The factor comparison method is a special ranking method. It requires ranking each job's factors and then adding up the points representing the numbers of degrees of each factor the job has. Employers seldom use this method today. Job classification is a job evaluation method in which raters categorize jobs into groups. We call these groups classes if they contain similar jobs, or grades if they contain jobs that are similar in difficulty but otherwise different. In practice, there are several ways to categorize jobs. One is to write class or grade summaries or descriptions similar to job descriptions. You then place jobs into classes or grades based on how well they fit each description. Another is to write a set of compensable factors or rules for each class. For instance, how much independent judgment, skill, or physical effort does the class of jobs require? Then categorize each job according to those rules. The usual procedure blends these two. The analysts choose compensable factors and then develop short class or grade descriptions that describe each class or grade in terms of the amount or level of factors in those jobs. The classification method has several advantages. The main one is that most employers usually end up grouping jobs in classes or grades anyway, to avoid having to price separately dozens or hundreds of jobs. Of course, the job classification automatically groups the employer's jobs into classes. The disadvantages are that it isn't easy to write the class or grade description, and considerable judgment is required to apply them. Yet many employers use this method with much success. The point method determines the degree to which jobs contain compensable factors. The point method of job evaluation is the most popular method used today. It involves identifying several compensable factors for jobs, as well as the degree to which each factor is present in each job. Assume there are 5 degrees of the compensable factor responsibility a job could contain. Further, assume you assign a different number of points to each degree of each compensable factor. Once the evaluation committee determines the degree to which the compensable factor is present in a job, it can calculate a total point value for the job by adding up the corresponding degree points for each factor. The result is a quantitative point rating for each job. Using job evaluation methods such as the point method can be very time-consuming. Accumulating the information about how much of each compensable factor the job contains is a tedious process. The evaluation committees must debate the level of each compensable factor in each job. They then write down their consensus judgments and compute each job's point values or rankings. Many employers therefore turn to computerized systems. Most of these computerized systems have 2 main components. First, There's a structured questionnaire. This contains items such as enter the total number of employees who report to this position. Second, such systems may use statistical models. These allow the computer program to price jobs more or less automatically. It's impractical and unnecessary to evaluate each job separately. Therefore, the first step in the point method is to select benchmark jobs. Benchmark jobs are representative of the jobs the employer needs to evaluate. The Equal Pay Act of 1963 uses 4 compensable factors: skill, effort, responsibility, and working conditions. The choice of compensable factors depends on traditional and practical considerations. For example, if your competitive advantage is quality, you might substitute responsibility for quality, for working conditions, or simply add it as a 5th factor. Similarly, using working conditions makes little practical sense for evaluating executive jobs. The employer should carefully define each factor. This is to ensure that the evaluation committee members will each apply the factors with consistency. The human resource specialist often draws up the definitions. The next step is to determine the relative importance of each factor. This is important because each cluster of jobs, some factors are bound more important than others are. Thus, for executive jobs, the mental requirements factor could carry far more weight than physical requirements. As an example, you might assign percentage weights of 60% for the factor job complexity and 30% for effort and 10% for working conditions. To assign weights, we assume we have to total 100 percentage points to allocate for each job. Next, we want to convert the percentage weights to point values for each compensable factor. It is traditional to assume that we're working with a total of 1,000 points. To convert percentages to points for each compensable factor, multiply the percentage weight for each compensable factor from the previous step by 1,000. Doing so in this case would translate into 1,000 times 60, or 600 possible points for job complexity, 1,000 times 30 for 300 points of effort, and 1,000 times 0.10 for 100 points for working conditions. These factors, 60, 30, and 10, represent the percentages assigned by weight in the previous step. This is the maximum number of points for each compensable factor. In job evaluation, we need to split each factor into degrees and define each. Thus, for a compensable factor such as job complexity, you might choose to have 5 degrees, ranging from here's the job that's routine to uses independent judgment. The number of degrees usually does not exceed 5 or 6, and the actual number depends mostly on judgment. Thus, if all employees work either in a quiet, air-conditioned office or in a noisy, hot factory, then 2 degrees would probably suffice for the factor working conditions. You need not have the same number of degrees for each factor. The job evaluation committee must be able to determine the points each job is worth. To do this, the committee must be able to examine each job from each factor's degree definitions, determine what degree of each compensable factor that job has. For them to do this, we must first assign points to each degree of each compensable factor. For example, we might have 5 possible degrees of job complexity, and the job complexity compensable factor is worth up to 600 points maximum. In this case, we simply decide that the first degree level of job complexity is worth 120, or 1/5 of 600 points. And each level increases by 120 points until the 5th level, which is worth the maximum 600 points. We then do this for each factor. Job evaluation involves determining the degree to which the job contains compensable factors. The team conducting the job evaluation will frequently do so by first reviewing each job's job description and job specification. It's through job analysis that the manager identifies the job duties and responsibilities and writes the job description and specification. Ideally, the job description includes information about compensable factors. A job evaluation committee determines the degree to which each compensable factor is present in a job. Knowing the degrees for each job and the number of points we assign to each degree of each compensable factor, we can determine how job complexity, effort, and working condition points each benchmark job should contain. We add up the degree points for each job to determine the total number of points, which enables us to list a hierarchy of jobs based on points. Jobs with more points should command higher pay, but organizations need to determine whether to use their own internal pay rates or pay rates based on what the external market is paying. With a market competitive pay system, the employer's actual pay rates are competitive with those in the relevant labor market, as well as equitably internally. Wage curves play a central role in assigning wage rates to jobs. The wage curve typically shows the pay rates paid for jobs relative to the points or rankings assigned to each job by the job evaluation. The purpose of the wage curve is to show the relationships between the value of the job expressed in points as determined by one of the job evaluation methods and the pay rates for the job. The pay rates on the wage curve are traditionally those now paid by the employer. However, if there's a reason to believe the current rates are out of step with market rates for these jobs, the employer will have to adjust them. To do this, compare a wage curve with current wage rates to one with market wage rates. We start by drawing an internal wage curve when it comes to determining market wage rates. Plotting each job evaluation point and the wage rate the employer is now paying for each job, or wage rates if there are several for each job, produces this type of scatter plot. We can now draw a wage curve that you see through the scatter plot. These plots show how point values relate to current wage rates. We can draw this wage line by just estimating a line that best fits the plotted points by minimizing the distances between the plots and the curve. This will produce a current internal wage curve that best fits the plotted points. The current internal wage curve is helpful in this process. For example, showing how a job's current pay rate compares its points helps the employer identify jobs for which pay rates are currently too high or low relative to other jobs in the organization. What the current internal wage curve does not reveal is whether our pay rates are too high, too low, or just right relative to what other firms are paying. For this, we need to draw a market or external wage curve. To draw the market or external wage curve, we produce a scatter plot and a wage curve. However, instead of using our firm's current wages, we use market wage rates obtained from salary surveys. The market external wage curve compares our job points with market pay rates for our jobs. How different are the market rates other employers are paying for our jobs and the current rates we're now paying for those jobs? We combined both current and internal and market and external wage curves into one graph to answer this question. The market wage curve might be higher than our current wage curve, suggesting that our current pay rates may be too low, or below our current wage curve, suggesting that our current wage rates might be too high. Based on comparing the current internal wage curve and the market external wage curve, we must decide whether to adjust the current pay rates for our jobs, and if so, how. This calls for a policy decision by management. Strategic considerations influence this decision. Do our strategic aspirations suggest we should pay more, the same, or less than our competitors? For example, we might decide to move our current internal wage curve up or down, or adjust the slope of the internal wage curve to increase what we pay for some jobs and decrease what we pay for others. The wage curve we end up with should now be equitable internally and equitable externally. Employees typically group similar jobs in terms of points into grades for pay purposes. Then, instead of having to deal with hundreds of job rates, you might only have to focus on, say, pay rates for 10 or 12 pay grades. A pay or wage grade is comprised of jobs that approximately equal difficulty or importance as determined by job evaluation. If you've used the point method of job evaluation, the pay grade consists of jobs falling within a range of points. If the ranking method was used, the grade consists of a specific number of ranks. If you use a classification system, then your jobs are already categorized into classes. Most employers do not pay just one rate for all jobs in a particular pay grade. Instead, employers develop vertical pay ranges for each of the horizontal pay grades or pay classes. These pay or rate ranges often appear as vertical boxes within each grade, showing minimum, maximum, and midpoint pay rates for that grade. Alternatively, you may depict the pay range for each class or grade as steps in a table. Here, you'll have specific corresponding pay rates for each step within the grade in a tabular form. Most employers structure their rate ranges to overlap a bit, so an employee in one grade who has more experience or seniority may earn more than would someone in an entry-level position in the next higher pay grade. There are several reasons to use pay ranges for each pay grade. First, it lets the employer take a more flexible stance in the labor market. Pay ranges also let organizations provide for performance differences between employees within the same grade or between those with different seniority. Compensation experts sometimes use compa ratios. The compa ratio equals the employee's pay rate divided by the pay range midpoint for their pay grade. A compa ratio of 1 means the employee is being paid exactly at the pay range midpoint. If the compa ratio is above 1, then the person's pay rate exceeds the midpoint pay for the job. If it's below, then the pay rate is less than the midpoint. The compa ratio reveals how many jobs are paid above and below competitive market rates. We will want to add our remaining jobs to the wage structure as a final step. We can do this in two ways. We can evaluate each of the remaining jobs using the same process we went through to measure and implement benchmark jobs. Or we can simply slot the remaining jobs into the wage structure where we feel that they belong without formally evaluating and assigning points to these jobs. Jobs similar enough to our benchmark jobs we can easily slot into the wage structure. Jobs we're not so sure about should undergo the same evaluation process. We assign points to them and precisely slot them into the wage structure. The wage rate an organization is now paying may fall well outside the rate range for its grade. This means that the average pay for the job is currently too high or too low relative to other jobs in the organization. For underpaid jobs, the solution is clear. Raise the wages of underpaid employees to the minimum of the rate range for the pay grade. Current pay rates falling above the rate range are a different story, and there are several ways to cope with the problem. One is to freeze the rate paid to these employees until general salary increases bring other jobs into line. A second option is to transfer or promote the employees involved to jobs for which you can legitimately pay them their current pay rate. The third option is to freeze the rate for 6 months, during which you try to transfer or promote the overpaid employee. Cut the rate you pay these employees to the maximum in the pay range for the pay grade is a last resort. Executive pay has become a contentious topic today. Whatever it is that accounts for CEO pay, it's apparently not always company performance. In one survey, the best performing CEOs received the lowest average compensation, while those in low performing companies were paid relatively well. In another study that had three main factors: job complexity, the employer's ability to pay, and the executive's human capital, accounted for about two-thirds of executive compensation variance. In practice, external equity plays a big role in setting top managers' compensation. A board of directors compensation committee may retain a compensation consultant, and together they will choose and analyze top executive pay in what they consider to be peer companies. Critics argue that this process creates upward pressures on CEO compensation because peer companies are often the ones with higher paid CEOs. Below the CEO, many employers use job evaluation for pricing managerial jobs, at least below top jobs. The basic approach is to classify executive and management positions into grades, each with a salary range. However, firms also use job classification and point methods with compensable factors like position scope, complexity, and difficulty. Job analysis, salary surveys, and fine-tuning salary levels around wage curves play roles in this process. Compensation for a company's top executives usually consists of several main elements. Base pay includes the person's fixed salary. Bonuses are single payments generally to reward the manager for achieving a specific goal, such as total company profit over $18 million. Short-term incentives are usually cash or stock bonuses for achieving progress towards strategic goals, such as reducing reliance on domestic sales from 80 to 50%. Long-term incentives aim to encourage the executive to take actions that drive up the value of the company's stock and include things like stock options. Finally, executive benefits and perks include things such as supplemental executive retirement pension plans. Salary is traditionally the cornerstone of executive compensation. On it, employers layer benefits, incentives, and prerequisites. Top executive compensation packages can be millions of dollars. Executive compensation emphasizes performance more than other pay plans, so the issue here is identifying the appropriate performance measure. Typical short-term measures include revenue growth and operating profit margin. Long-term measures include rate of return above some predetermined base. Employers must be alert to the tax and securities law implications for their executive compensation package. Employers should first ensure that the person's actually a professional under the law. The Fair Labor Standards Act provides an exemption from both minimum wage and overtime pay for employees employed as a bona fide executive, administrative, professional, and outside sale employee. In addition to earning at least $455 per week, to qualify as a professional under the law, the person's main duty must be the performance of working requiring advanced knowledge. Beyond that, compensating professionals such as engineers and attorneys presents unique challenges. Analytical jobs like these emphasize compensable factors such as creativity and problem solving that are not easily measured. Employers can and do use job evaluation for professional jobs. Compensable factors here tend to focus on problem solving, creativity, job scope, and technical knowledge and expertise. Firms use the point method and job classification in these scenarios. Yet in practice, firms rarely rely on just job evaluation for pricing professional jobs. Factors like creativity are hard to measure, and non-pay issues often influence professionals' job decisions. Most employers therefore emphasize a market pricing approach for these jobs. They price professional jobs in the marketplace as best they can to establish the values for benchmark jobs and then slot them into a salary structure. Each professional discipline, such as engineer, usually ends up having 4 to 6 grade levels with each a broad salary range. This helps employers remain competitive when bidding for professionals. Most firms end up with pay plans that slot jobs into classes or grades. For example, the US government's pay plan consists of 15 main grades, each with its own pay range. For an employee whose job falls into one of these grades, the pay range for that grade dictates minimum and maximum salary. The question is, how wide should the salary grades be in terms of the number of job evaluation points they include? There's a downside to having, say, 15 narrow grades. For instance, if you want someone whose job is in grade 2 to fill in for a time in a job that happens to be in grade 1, it's difficult to reassign that person without lowering their salary. That's why some organizations broadband their pay plans. Broadbanding means collapsing salary grades into just a few wide levels or bands, each of which contains a relatively wide range of jobs and pay levels. For the jobs that fall in this broadband, there's a much wider range of pay rates available. You can move an employee from job to job within the broadband more easily without worrying about the employees moving outside the relatively narrow range associated with a traditional narrow pay grade. This can make it easier to train someone on a higher level job. Comparable worth requires equal pay to men and women for jobs of comparable value. This means comparing dissimilar jobs such as nurses and mechanics. Comparable worth has implications for job evaluation. Virtually every comparable worth case that reached courts involved the point method of job evaluation. By assigning points to dissimilar jobs, point plans facilitate comparability rankings or ratings among different jobs. Should employers still use these point plans? Perhaps the wisest approach is for employers to price their jobs as they see fit. The company's board of directors is responsible for setting and approving top executive pay. First, legislation gives various governmental agencies oversight over executive pay. To ensure adequate disclosure, the Securities and Exchange Commission, known as the SEC, requires detailed compensation-related information for the CEO, Chief Financial Officer, and the next three highest paid executives. The Dodd-Frank Law of 2010 requires that American companies give shareholders a non-binding say on pay. The Sarbanes-Oxley Act makes executives personally liable, under certain conditions, for corporate financial oversight lapses. Second, CEO pay, compared with an average worker's pay, has mushroomed in the past 20 years or so. The pay gap is about 6 times larger than it was then. Boards, therefore, face shareholder activism on executive pay. Law firms file class action suits demanding information from companies about their executive pay decisions. As of 2018, public corporations in the United States must compute a ratio of CEO to median company employee pay. There are some questions that we must ask when it comes to executive pay. Has our compensation committee identified its duties and processes? Are they using appropriate advisors? Are there compensation issues to address? And do our procedures demonstrate diligence? Is our committee appropriately communicating its decisions when it comes to executive and employee pay? Total rewards is an important concept in compensation management. When it comes to jobs, people have many needs. For challenging work, and for respect and appreciation as an example, not all of which are satisfied by pay or bonuses. Total rewards encompass not only compensation and benefits, but also personal and professional growth opportunities and a motivating work environment. It includes not just traditional financial rewards, but also non-financial and intangible rewards such as recognition, career development opportunities, good relationships with colleagues, and a great work climate. Specific total rewards also include recognition and career development. When it comes to employee engagement, both rewards seem essential. For example, one study found that base pay and benefits alone were weakly related to engagement. However, intangible rewards had high or very high impacts on engagement and performance when combined with base salary and short-term incentives or bonuses. It's therefore not surprising that many high engagement employers emphasize total rewards. In addition to offering such rewards, the employer should issue total reward statements periodically. List all the rewards, financial and non financial, the company offers, and note their importance to the employee's overall well being. This increases their impact.